food. It might be getting likes on social media, all of those quick fix solutions that we know don't necessarily bring us long-term sustainable happiness, but despite the fact that we are really aware that happiness is acquired through meaning, family, all those things, we're seeking it in a different way. So that led us to start to explore a little bit more deeply the two different types of well-being that we know about. So that first one we call hedonia. So you'll be familiar with the term hedonism, I'm sure. Hedonia or hedonic well-being is all about pleasure. It's about enjoyment and it's about absence of distress. And we know that as human beings, everything we do is about moving towards pleasure and moving away from pain. Naturally, that's what we do. Eudaimonia, on the other hand, or eudaimonic well-being, this term was coined by Aristotle. So it's an ancient term in regards to well-being. This is all about authenticity, meaning, excellence, and also personal growth. And the interesting thing about personal growth is that growth requires doing the hard stuff. So this is where we talk a lot about experiencing and accepting negative emotions as well, that it's not always about pleasure. It's not about moving away from pain. So if you think about those two questions I posed to you before, everything that we think about when we pose the question of what brings us true happiness is eudaimonic. Everything that we respond to, that family and all that, tends to sit in that eudaimonic circle. However, when I asked how does society or communities tend to seek happiness, what do we see? Pretty much everything there sits in that hedonic circle, so that hedonic well-being. So we have this real mismatch between what we know brings us lasting happiness or well-being and then what we're seeking. And we see a lot more of this as we talk a bit more later in, of course, first world countries than we do in third world countries. So if I break the word eudaimonia down, basically it means good spirit, or if we look at the root words, true, where that authenticity piece really comes in quite strongly. Okay, now I'm going to get you to do an activity. I know we're on Zoom to do this, but what I want you to do is I want you just for a moment to close your eyes, and I want you to think about 2 to 3 of the most meaningful experiences in your life. And then when you've got them, you can open your eyes. Okay. Now, can you just call out to me, so anybody at a time, can you just tell me what emotions did you feel were attached to or associated with that event? So what emotions were attached with that meaningful event that you thought about? So just anybody?
Joy.
Joy.
Love.
Love.
Happiness. Fulfillment.
Sadness.
Yeah.
Fear.
Uncertainty.
Yeah.
Pride.
Beautiful.
Okay.
So I'm just going to stop you on that for a minute. So we had a real mix of emotions there. Did anybody else feel sadness or fear or any other negative emotion attached with any of those events? Just say yes if you did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we're talking about well-being, we're talking about happiness. But interestingly enough, we often think about that as being attached to happy moments and pleasurable moments. But in actual fact, we know that through some of the most meaningful events in our life, through the most eudaimonic events in our life, there has been perhaps those negative emotions attached. So what we know is that meaning is generated through happy, but also sad moments. So it's not just in those moments of positive feeling or positive regard. Now, I just want to alert you to this, this research for a moment. Michael Steger actually shared this last year when he was in Australia talking about some of these concepts. But as you can see, and this has been updated since, and it just continues to show more progress. But as you can see here, you've got meaning in life on this axis. And then on the bottom, you've got GDP per capita. So basically, you're looking at the amount of wealth per country. What you can see through the map, that as GDP increases, as countries become wealthier, what happens to meaning in life generally is that it starts to drop off a little bit. So some of the countries sitting around the top here, however, even though they are quite far out in terms of GDP at the top, a lot of those have a very strong sense of belongingness, togetherness, spirituality, religiosity in some of them as well, comes through really strongly. And then if we look over here, as meaning starts to drop off, some of these schools and communities and countries down the bottom in particular, Hong Kong, for example, which sits very low. You probably remember me saying last time I worked with you, we have a large partner school network over there. And that's somewhere where it is really, really tricky and difficult to cultivate wellbeing. There's lots of concerns, lots of issues. So definitely consistent with where we have really high meaning in life, it tends to be many of those poorer countries. So eudaimonia, two ways of looking at it, and this is described by Dr. Ross. Basically, eudaimonia we can think of as feeling purpose. Hedonia is all about the feel good. And it's not to say that we don't have any hedonia or we don't aim for hedonia, but ultimately we want to have a mix of the two, and we call that the fulfilled life. And I know somebody said before that they felt fulfilled in their meaningful moment. But this is what I find really fascinating. This is what we know, that eudaimonia yields hedonia, but the opposite isn't always true. So research basically tells us that the pursuit of meaning will always give happiness, but the pursuit of happiness or positive emotions won't always give the opposite, if that makes sense. So the sense that your personal life is meaningful to you, this is some research, I won't read all this out, but basically is a cornerstone of psychological well-being. So you can see down here, this is what all the research shows, that it's tightly tied to being happier, more positive, more confident, more caring, helpful, resilient, and more satisfied in your life, relationships and work. So it's no surprise that that meaning piece is so fundamental. When we think about the PERMA model in particular, which I know many of you are familiar with, Seligman's PERMA model, that positive emotion, engagement, relationship, meaning and accomplishment, I've always truly believed that relationships and meaning should actually sit above the model, that they're both so fundamental and so important to well-being. But after all the work and the research that we've done in the meaning piece, I truly believe meaning and eudaimonia needs to sit right up the top, even above the relationship bit. We also know from the research that we live longer if we have meaning and purpose in our lives. Interestingly enough, the research clearly states that it's actually up to 10 years longer where there is meaning and purpose in our lives. So that's some pretty incredible research that shows just not how important it is for our well-being, but also in terms of that longevity piece as being really fundamental.
Andrea, I just wanted to, Rotarians are a really interesting group of people because, you know, they do live to a good old age, and, you know, I firmly believe that it's anchored in that whole meaning. Yeah,
Absolutely. And it comes through, right, it comes through really strongly too in, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the Power 9 study, so the blue zones. So I know Adam and Ed, I'm sure you are both, but if you haven't had a look at that, it is really interesting research that was done across the world, looking at not only people that live to be over 100, but also have higher health and well-being than those up to 20, 30 years younger than them. And the meaning, the purpose, that stuff comes through incredibly strong. So really interesting. Now here we've got basically, this is the umbrella of eudaimonia and what sits underneath it. So I said before, being authenticity, that's huge underneath eudaimonia. Next to it here, we've got self-determination theory, which is one of the theories that's come out of positive psychology you may be familiar with. This one, interestingly enough, if you do already know it, it sits right underneath eudaimonia. So when we're focusing on self-determination theory, we're actually cultivating eudaimonia. And I'll explain briefly for those of you who aren't aware of it, what that means in a moment. Next to that here, we've got psychological wellbeing. Pleasure, you can see, sits on the outside. It's cultivated by eudaimonia, but it's not actually under the umbrella of eudaimonia. It's what we get as a result. But flow, so Mike Chicks at New High's work on flow and meaning certainly sit underneath it as well. So just quickly to go through what some of those things mean before I start to challenge your thinking a little bit in this space. Self-determination theory, for those of you who aren't aware, basically is comprised of 3 things in order to be motivated and reach a goal. And I think this work is more fundamental with young people really than ever before, but not only young people, really all of us. And the 3 levels are basically we need autonomy to be motivated and to achieve. And that's the need to choose what one's doing, basically being an agent of one's own life. The next is competence, the need to feel confident in what you're doing. And also relatedness, so no surprise, the need for human connections that are close, that are secure, that provide psychological safety, while still respecting autonomy and also facilitating competence. One of the things we often don't think about with that relatedness one as well is it's not just about the relationships you have with others that matter. Ed and I had a great great conversation this afternoon about this. It's as much about the relationship that one has with themselves. We know through the neuroscience that changes the structure of the brain in the exact same way as it does based on the relationship you have with other people. But it's often one that we miss. Someone can be very connected and related to others, but might not have that strong sense of self, that spirituality. Flow, I'm sure this concept is more familiar, but I'll go over it quickly for you before we start to go into a bit of discussion. Flow is where the goals are really clear, feedback's immediate, there's balance between opportunity and capacity, your concentration deepens. Present is what really matters, control is no problem, and it's almost like we have a sense of time that's altered, like time stands still, so you're completely absorbed in what you're doing that maybe a whole hour felt like 5 minutes. You know, you lose track of time. So a lot of people report they're in flow when they're, it could be gardening, it could be running, it could be reading, things that the challenge is high enough for you to also meet your interests and your strengths. And interestingly enough, one of the really important things in flow is there is a complete loss of ego. You will love this language, and I certainly love it as well, because it's a shift from that, you know, that ego driven system, if you like, to more of an eco-driven system. It becomes about more than ourselves. Now, to explain the difference for you between the two, remember I said that we know in the Western world from our own assumptions, but also through what research tells us, that we are definitely pursuing this type of well-being more. Hedonic well-being is where pleasure is maximised, pain is avoided. And interestingly enough, we know that it can cause the following things: addiction, chronic escapism, destructive impulsivity, selfishness, antisocial behaviour, greed, excessive consumerism and the like. And I think COVID was just such an interesting experiment where we certainly started to see a lot of that hedonic side come out in a lot of different situations. Now, this came out of the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey last year, and I think this is also fascinating as we make the links between acquiring wellbeing through hedonia, that severe childhood trauma increases the likelihood of addiction by 4,600%. So what we know is that if you have young people that have experienced trauma, they are far more likely to try and acquire wellbeing through hedonic pathways. And remember I said before that hedonia is strongly linked with addiction. And the reason being is because it's that quick fix, moving towards pleasure, quick fix happiness, that spike that gives us maybe a sense of elation. So that's where that chronic escapism comes in. They tend to move away from eudaimonic wellbeing, and we can't have wellbeing alone if we're only focusing on hedonia or hedonic wellbeing. There has to be that sense of meaning, purpose, eudaimonia that's present. So something to be really aware of. It also can lead to what we call that hedonic adaptation trap, where we have a desire, we get it, then we adapt, then we're unhappy, then we want the next best thing. So it might happen with cars, with iPhones, with iPads, with anything in our lives where it gives us that spike initially. But then until we get, the next thing or the best next thing, then we don't actually stay with sustainable levels of happiness. So it has that point of diminishing return, if you like. And it also ends up looking a bit like that hedonic treadmill too, where that disappointment kicks in. We just become so used to what we get. And I guess in many respects, you can now see the difference between our first world and third world countries, where eudaimonic wellbeing is really prioritized because there's less access to things. So that hedonic wellbeing doesn't come through as strongly. There's more of a sense of community, tribe, togetherness, and support for each other. So I'm really quickly going to go through the solid differences between the two, deepen it a little bit more for you. Then I'm going to ask you some questions. And as I said, we're going to use a collaborative tool around that. And then I'm going to share with you some of the ways we've been focusing really heavily on flipping this focus in wellbeing within our networks. So happiness you might think of as hedonic wellbeing. So I've put those two as being interchangeable. And meaning you might think of as eudaimonic wellbeing. And I guess too, as we're going through some of these, you might be wondering, have we been misled? So the first obvious thing, I guess, is that we know happiness is short-term, whereas eudaimonia, if you like, or meaning is long-term. It's more sustainable, even through those experiences that some of you shared that might have had pain attached to them, or fear, or sadness. Happiness is usually linked to the present moment. Of course, it's always good to be in the present moment. However, because of this, the moment can become an excuse for escape mechanisms against worry, anxiety, and other ugly feelings. And I guess this is why we see a lot of that increase in hedonic behaviours. It might even be drug use and things like that, from trying to escape from those other feelings that might exist, because we know that it's going to give that automatic happiness in that present moment. The next one is all around personal expressiveness. Expressiveness we know is positively related to meaning. Probably no surprise that the hedonic wellbeing is highly associated with the taker. What can I get from this guy? Whereas eudaimonic wellbeing is more associated with the giver. What can I do for you? And in our communities of wellbeing, I know we certainly talk a lot about contribution and cooperation over competition. So this is a really big one where we know that eudaimonic wellbeing is completely attached to being the giver. This, I think, is absolutely fascinating research, and just shows you how powerful eudaimonic wellbeing is. People who have high levels of happiness but have low to no sense of meaning have gene expression patterns like that of those who are experiencing chronic adversity. When eudaimonia can't keep up with hedonia, we literally can get sick. Feeling a wide range of emotions is counterintuitively better for us. So they call that emodiversity. Experiencing different emotions besides happiness can help guard ourselves against depression in the long term. It's really interesting when I ask parents this question at parent evenings, when you say, what do you most want for your children? And a lot of them will say to be happy all the time. And when we read this research, it's actually really obvious that that's not what we want. We don't want actually to be happy all the time. We want to be able to experience negative emotions and know they're a fundamental part of life. but not let them stay with us for too long, if you like. So the next main difference is around deep and shallow relationships. So hedonic wellbeing is about more so those shallow relationships, if you like. So forming relationships primarily with happiness in mind tends to give us shallow ones, whereas eudaimonic wellbeing tends to give us a lot deeper relationships and more sustainable ones. Life satisfaction and personal growth, these two are partly independent of each other, but I guess it's important to know that not all of your problems will be solved if you only ever try and be happy all the time. As I said earlier, growth truly demands doing the hard stuff and being able to sit with that hard stuff as well to grow. So I guess one of the things that we really in our work started to think about and acknowledge is just the evolution. In particular for us, it was around education and how that's evolved. That throughout the 19th century, it was very much about, you know, the curriculum prepared young people for being able to get jobs, that very much industrial model. And then as we expanded into the 20th century, interestingly enough, if you look at all the research, that's where we started to focus more on individual fulfillment, self-fulfillment. And what do you think started to creep into the curriculum more so? It was all around happiness education, and it was all around, you know, that feel-good stuff. That became a real priority. So as we look towards the future, and I know the OECD are doing a lot around this as well, we need to focus on not only children realising their potential, but also thinking about how they can contribute to making the world a better place. Moving away from that feeling of I have to be happy all the time and bombarding with them with a curriculum that says so or teaches them to be happy all the time. And we need to start focusing a lot more on that eudaimonic approach. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to use a tool called Slido. I'm just going to come back to you for a minute, stop sharing, and I'm going to share again because I'm going to share a different screen with you. Okay. Now, has everybody got with them, if you don't, that's okay, because we can use a different tool, but has everybody got with them a device? It could be like your iPhone or something else with you that you could take a photo of a QR code on. Does everyone have, just pop your hand up for me so I can see if everyone's got something with them. Okay, and if you don't, that's okay. Cute, our little baby. if you don't, I'll just get you just to copy the web code that comes up the address, and you can enter it into your computer from there. So I'm going to share with you now. This is a really great collaborative tool that can be used called Slido. So what I'm going to ask you first of all is when I load this full screen. All right, so I'm going to just get you to take a photo, if you can, with your phone, just on your camera of that QR code up in the left top corner. And when you take a photo of that, it's going to lead you straight to a page with that question, what has resonated the most? Now, when that happens and when you're ready, could you type in if anything has jumped out for you in 1 or 2 words that's resonated with what I've shared so far in terms of those 2 different types of wellbeing. So what are your thoughts or your feelings? What have you connected with? What's jumped out? Or what are you most surprised about? And this is a word cloud. We're going to do this first one in a word cloud. So just pop in 1 or 2 words and you can put in as many as you like. Might even be questions or wonderings that you're having. It's a good one, addiction to happiness.
even on? I'm in a meeting at the moment. Yes, yeah, just a Zoom. Can I ring you? I'll ring you back.
Okay, there's still a couple more coming in there. Okay. Beautiful. Okay. So feel free to keep putting it in if you like. And I'm going to now flick to the next question for you. So this time it's going to come up more as a text box. So I want you to think about the following. What potential is there for your communities of wellbeing when you consider this? What potential do you see when you start to think more about those two different types of wellbeing, so hedonic and eudaimonic wellbeing? What potentially lies there that could be used or focused on? What's coming to mind already? So take a photo of this QR code if it hasn't come up in your device, or you can join at slido.com and there's the code there. And then when you're ready, I just want you to type in, so these will come out as beautiful, as more of a text box than a word cloud. Excellent. Okay. So feel free to keep typing in there. And then I'm going to flick to just one more last question for you before we start to look at some of what we've found in our networks. Beautiful. I like that last one too. So the next question I'm going to get you to think about is, how might you shift the focus to a eudaimonic approach? So how might you, and you might say, I think we focus on this beautifully. I don't think that the focus is massively around happiness, education, or hedonia. So you might emphasize some things that you're already doing really well that are eudaimonic in nature. But if we think about communities of wellbeing, if we think about education, if we think about all of society, and in particular with our young people, how might we shift the focus to a more eudaimonic approach? Or it could even be with elderly people too, given that we know that research too around the living longer, the more fulfilled life. So that's what I'm going to get you to think about now. And I'm going to pop that question up. So how might we shift the focus to a eudaimonic approach? Or what are we already doing that is eudaimonic that we know is more fundamental than ever now, and we can focus on more strongly? Thinking again around authenticity, which is very much values-based, meaning, purpose, personal growth. What are some of the things that are coming to mind? So you might need to take a new photo if that hasn't come up for you. I think that's a really big one that you've just put in too. I think a lot of our funding and a lot of our policy makers, the more problems we have in the space with mental health, the more we tend to put into happiness education. In my mind, there's no doubt that happiness education certainly undermines the eudaimonic approach. So I think an education piece around this is certainly fundamental. Beautiful. Mm. Beautiful. Appreciative inquiry is such a great example that you've used of cultivating collective awareness. I'll send an article that has just been published recently, again by Otto Sharma, but on how timely COVID has been with really cultivating more and deeper collective awareness. Yeah, I really like that one about the funding too. Absolutely. Amazing. Really, 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 really good ideas coming out there. Beautiful. There's a beautiful activity just on whoever wrote that, tell our personal stories, that you could easily do as a group. We do it with all of our every single network undertakes this activity that's worked with us, and it's called Story of Self, Us, Now, and it looks at the evolution of how each of us have evolved. So it's very much a systems approach because it starts with the individual and moves towards purpose, and then it moves towards the collective, and it's just a beautiful way of coming together and doing that. But I think any focus on meaning and purpose and needs to include the why, and the story is such a big important part of that. Okay, so I'm going to just keep going with that. I'm going to leave that poll open for you, but I'm going to come back for a moment to the group. Okay, so before I just finish up with some examples of how this is being, deeply embedded or brought alive, or how we're really focusing on this eudaimonic approach with some of the networks that I work with, would anyone like to share or emphasize or feel really strongly about anything that they popped up on our collaborative tools then? Is anything coming to mind that you can think of or that really jumps out that you would like to talk more deeply about? I'm just going to give you the opportunity before I keep talking to share if you would like.
I think one of the difficulties is in our society. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so who am I looking at? Is that Pam?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, beautiful.
I think one of the things that came across for me looking at both models is the type of society we live in. And we live in very much a capitalist, quick fix society. And how you deal with that in terms of what people are sold, the media, advertising, and how you actually counteract that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a good point you've raised, Pam. And that's why the collective awareness piece is so fundamental. One of the first things I always say is this work is not overnight work. This is not quick fix work. You know that with the journey that you've been on as well. you know, sometimes it's hard to see everything you have done, but you have achieved so much. And I think if it was quick fix, if it was overnight change, it wouldn't be sustainable. And we are up against it. You know, the frustrations I shared a little bit before about the challenges that the Geelong community are facing at the moment with their recent spate of suicides. It's just continuous. And one of the hardest things has been just looking at all the posts on social media that are just, social media is being bombarded with, I'm sure, things that are best intentions. But one of the things I always say that comes from the systems thinking quote is, you know, if we don't understand the interrelatedness between things, and from our actions, often there are unintended consequences that will occur. And that's a big problem in our quick fix society, that we need to take the time to understand interrelatedness. We need to be aware, and that comes from conversations, that comes from communities coming together exactly like you're doing, and it comes from cultivating awareness, coming from a place of fear to, hope over fear. So a really good point, Pam. Anybody else? Okay, so what I'll do is I'm just going to pop up now just the last slides for you. I'm going to, without going deeply into it, I'm just going to explain for you. So some of the things that we've been focusing on in the networks, we're actually supposed to be in New Zealand last week with 20 school principals. That we were starting to really take this work quite deeply after, as I said, last year we worked with Robert Steele from United Nations and Compass Education. So he has been a huge influence, I guess, on developing the Sustainable Development Goals on distance mapping. So we did a lot of work as a network around that. And this was our year for activating and deepening the work. And, you know, we've done heaps around eudaimonia. But lots of the schools, despite that kind of being put off, are still starting to bring this alive. The reason why we I guess chose New Zealand for this next immersion, as many of you know, last time I think we were just going on our first Indonesian Green School immersion when I spoke with a group last time, is because school we were looking at over there is a school that is 100% a eudaimonic approach. It's all about learning aligned with purpose. It's all about a curriculum that is about deep meaning. And New Zealand, Michael Fullan's work, he's done a lot around deep learning. And it flicks the focus, I guess, which I feel passionate about, from just having happiness education and teaching wellbeing to actually doing, living, breathing, feeling wellbeing through the conditions that are being created. So the way that the school is set up, the way the curriculum is designed, it actually makes students experience these things like personal growth, authenticity, peace, and all of that comes alive. So I'm just going to pop up for you, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. The slides again. And I'm just going to, I know it's hard to get the whole snapshot of all this work in the time that we have, but just some of the things that we've been doing. So to Pam's statement before, which I thought was a brilliant one, we've been focusing a lot around how do we move from doing gratitude, how do we move from doing mindfulness to feeling gratitude, to feeling mindfulness, to feeling all of these things and being them, like bringing them alive, making sure that our values actually align with what we're doing. And that's been through just constant cultivating of that collective awareness, and not only with staff, educators, parents, community members, leaders, Catholic education members, but also with students, taking them on the journey of how we're getting them to feel these things. And I guess this is one of my favourite quotes when we think about this, that the success of our actions on change makers doesn't depend on what we do or how we do it, but on the inner place from which we operate. So it's not just about learning about it, it's about the experiential side of feeling it, experiencing it, and that's how we believe that we will most connect with this meaning and purpose. We also considered really strongly some of this research, but it came out of work from Barnes and Shirley, which is interestingly enough was 2007. But they have showed really clearly that when we place each child's personal quest, and it would be no different for adults, for meaning, at the heart of how and what we teach them, that this is one of the most likely ways to generate the resilient communities needed to face a future of unimaginable challenge and change. You know, we've been talking about that VUCA, that volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world we live in, and this unimaginable challenge is really starting to come alive more than ever in 2020, isn't it, with what we're seeing, not only with COVID, but so many of the challenges that the world's facing at the moment. We're just seeing that sense of urgency become a lot more. We are also flipped a lot of the learning in all of the schools to being learning that's aligned with purpose. So when I say that, I mean learning that's experiential and designed, learning that's authentic. So authentic learning means we're solving complex problems in real life settings. These young people aren't just learning about complex problems in a classroom, but they're out there, they're experiencing it, they're doing it, they're contributing to the world around them, and it's making them become more outward facing. There's a real sense of purpose for each of them. And I know a lot of this is education based because this is where we've been targeting it. But we've also had a really strong emphasis on increasing student agency. So this is not a new term, but basically we know that when we have more student agency, we have an empowered student, we have a student that cares, we have a student that feels meaning. And this is all about acting intentionally to lead and initiate, but also create positive change. We know when this happens for young people that they have a massively strong sense of eudaimonic wellbeing. We're flipping the focus as well towards collaboration and contribution. And that's one of the OECD's big focus at the moment too, towards a future of wellbeing in 2030. Interestingly enough, and I think I might have spoke a little bit to this last time, we have a system absolutely that breeds competition. There is no doubt about it, and values competition more than anything. But how interesting is it to know that competition, we know, actually depletes meaning. So where competition exists, eudaimonic wellbeing actually drops off, it declines, it depletes meaning, it takes away from meaning in our lives, and that's where we start to see a really strong sense of hyper-individualism occur, breaking away from each other, but we know that we're wired to be interconnected, that being a fundamental part of our DNA. So this is why the focus has been on collaboration, and so much of that has been designed through how we're actually creating these learning experiences that are authentic, that are experiential, and that use processes that enable this. I'll flick from that one. We're also, I find this really interesting, we're also assessing eudaimonia now in the schools, not happiness. Most measures, wellbeing measures, funnily enough, actually assess hedonic wellbeing and not eudaimonic wellbeing, which is really interesting given we know that hedonic wellbeing is really short term, whereas eudaimonic wellbeing is more long term, is more sustainable. So it's the wellbeing we really want not only young people but everyone to have, because we know it's the wellbeing that's going to set them up most for the future. So we're flipping our measurement towards more of a eudaimonic wellbeing, which actually talks about the negative emotions, the personal growth, the hard stuff as well. I really quickly want to share with you too, before we go to a Q&A, one of the most interesting things that's come through in my action research has been reviewing all of the wellbeing approaches across all of our schools. So what we've done is we've not only looked at all of the processes in place, the initiatives, the policies. So basically for you, it would be like looking at everything you're doing to cultivate communities of wellbeing at the moment, absolutely everything. And we've charted this on an iceberg model where, and I've done this probably now with about 40 schools, I'm starting to map all the data, where we've looked at whether the program or the initiative is a proactive one or a reactive one. And we've also looked at whether it's eudaimonic in nature or it's hedonic in nature. And what do you think that we've found? Probably no surprise. So much of it is reactive, and so much of it is actually about hedonic wellbeing and not eudaimonic wellbeing. So it might be things like the way the rewards systems are being done and things like that. One of the things we've asked is it has to come back to the intention behind why you're doing it, because some of the things we could justify, yep, they are eudaimonic in nature, but it's about the intention of why they're doing it. So it was really interesting for us to find that so many things that we're doing in our communities, our schools, are actually not only reactive, but they're also about cultivating that really short-term, quick fix hedonic well-being that, yep, we can measure, but is not actually going to be sustainable. A lot of this work we've done across primaries, and I just found it really interesting, the fact that we know that mental illness gets a lot more severe and worse as they get to secondary schools. How we cover that, if you like. We also have started to implement lots of practices that we know are most powerful for increasing eudaimonic wellbeing. So I said before, we're moving away from not just doing gratitude, not just doing mindfulness and so on, which I think, is the case a lot of the time, to how do we start truly feeling it and valuing it. One of the things that we know from the research that is most powerful in not only counteracting hedonic wellbeing, but also increasing eudaimonic wellbeing, interestingly enough, is loving kindness meditation. So this is a form of meditation that Ed and I were talking about this afternoon. It's very much about self-compassion. It's very much about that strong sense of spirituality. So spirituality not having to be about religiosity, but about a really strong connection between the self and the self. I said earlier, it's not just about the relationship you have with others that matter, but it's just as important to have a really positive, strong relationship with oneself. And loving kindness meditation has shown to not only increase that self-compassion, but also let go of negative emotions or things people might be holding on about other people. So just bringing in practices that we know are scientifically backed up by improving eudaimonic wellbeing. We've worked a lot on authenticity. I absolutely, I love this work. It's something that I really value. It is my number one value also, but eudaimonic wellbeing and authenticity are completely entwined. If we think about it, I love this term from this poem that some of the ancient Greek philosophers called the point of life eudaimonia. It's commonly translated as happiness, which is a misconception, but I believe a more accurate translation would be fittingness, how well your actions match your gifts and match who you are. And I think really ultimately that's what we want to aim for. So we've been working extensively on that notion of authenticity. So before we go to see if there's any questions, I know I've bombarded you with quite a bit, but I do want to leave you with this because I want you to remember what I said earlier about eudaimonia will always yield happiness or hedonia. However, the opposite is not always true. So if we're going to choose one over the other for sustainable long-term wellbeing, and if we're going to focus our programs, our initiatives, our efforts, our everything, this eudaimonic wellbeing is very neglected in Australia without a doubt, and is where we should be channeling a lot of our attention and focus. But as it says, make sure to savour the happiness after. That will certainly follow. So I'm going to leave you with that. If I can find the stop share. I'll come back to you in a moment. Okay, does that come back up? Can you see me? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So does anybody have any, I know I've just given you quite like a bit to think about, but has anybody got any questions, comments? Did anything stand out? Is this nothing new at all? I'm sure Adam's sitting there.
No. I think one of the things I wanted to mention was this notion that the meaning and our purpose has so much energy attached to it. It's sort of like this life-giving force that enables us to do the other things that we're doing in our life. And so being connected to that energy source, which is the meaning, and we can continually draw on that energy source to then be able to give in the capacities that we want to give based on that. So, that idea that happiness follows meaning, I think, yeah, there's an energy associated with that in terms of, energizing as opposed to depleting, when we know that it's something that connects to who we are and deeply with our values.
Oh, beautiful. Thanks, Ed. Absolutely.
I'm curious, Andrea, about the decline in participation in organised religion. So less people going to church for a number of reasons. But yeah, my understanding is that yes, there's less of that, and but still, we've got young people and children very mobilised and interested in climate change and around the planet. And, you know, Mother Nature and the universe and all of that is just as it's an equivalent thing to commit your life to and would give people a lot of meaning and purpose as well. So I'm just curious on your thoughts about whether or not kids who care about the planet, whether or not that would be an adequate substitute for some of the void in organised religion.
I'm really glad you asked that, Adam, because I have some very strong, very strong feelings on this one. And I guess, look, to start firstly with that decline in religion, absolutely, there's so many systemic, issues that have without a doubt created that. And there's so much solid research that we can't deny that shows, people with high faith correlates with high well-being. In particular, just that whole going to church or having a place to go, even if it was a sporting institute or something. We know that if you're doing that for no other reason, doesn't serve yourself rather than faith or belief or whatever it is, that's really good for your well-being. I guess the challenge with, the climate change and all of that is, we say when we're working on learning aligned with purpose, so whenever we're using these learning through experiential authentic processes, we always talk about avoiding the tokenism that becomes attached with that, or just doing what perhaps your friend's doing, or choosing what the crowd are doing, and that social media, that spreads really quickly. You wonder, it comes back to that authenticity piece. How much of it is truly, I'm doing this because I wholeheartedly believe in it, it's meaningful to me, I have faith in this, or how much am I doing it because I'm seeing everyone else on social media is doing it and I think that's what I should be doing. And that's
same with faith too, I guess. You get a lot of people who go to church because my parents have gone to church.
Yeah.
So it's a similar thing, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because everyone else is doing it, absolutely. But I think
there's a drop off in families where parents go to church and then our children following on and going to church. So, and particularly within their own communities, often it's very rare for them to stay in their own communities, but they will go and find another faith community of their own. But it's, and it's largely because churches haven't adapted to actually providing for the needs of their young people.
Yeah.
Because they're aging populations.
Yeah, spot on. And even as an educator, I think there's so much richness besides, there's so much that comes from just going somewhere, sitting, listening, learning, where it's not about you as well. One of the things that, we often talk about with young people is understanding that the world is so much bigger than us. And a lot of people don't realize that anymore, that the world is so much bigger than us. It's not about going somewhere to tell everyone you went there and that it was about you, go to Paris to be in Paris, not to take a photo and tell everyone that you were there or you were doing it or you were protesting or whatever it was. So I think to come back to your question, yes, absolutely, there'd be a following too with the faith side. But it needs to be genuine. It needs to be authentic. It needs to be about, I'm doing this because it's meaningful to me. And that's just what I worry about some of the initiatives with young people. How much do they truly understand it? I've had a great conversation with a psychologist around just the contradictions in young people and saying what they're really passionate about, what they're standing up for, but then what their behaviours are showing as well. With the climate change and all of that, what they're using, what they're doing is quite different to what they're saying that they most believe in. So yeah, for me, I just think that tokenism sometimes creeps in a bit. But we can't deny through all of the research or underestimate the power of what faith or just spirituality if it's not about religion. Just that connection between the self and the self brings, and also the neuroscience shows for brain wiring as well, super powerful for well-being, but it has to be authentic.
So I have a question. How do you, well, I'd like to hear you define authentic a little bit better, and how do you measure it?
Yep. So authenticity, a really good question, Peter. Authenticity is really about being true to who you are, but it's also about your actions and matching your values as well. So what you're doing is actually reflective of what you believe in or what you're talking about, or what you're saying. So no different to how I said before, you know, these young people that might be standing up for climate change massively and protesting for it and believing in it, but then they're littering or they're using technologies to excess that are adding to, you know, the pressure that we're putting on global warming and things like that. So your actions have to match your values, and it has to be true, I guess, true to who you really are. It's the best way I'd explain it.
But then you would have to accept then that a person can be authentic and match to their values and yet have a set of values which is an anathema to you. So that, for example, to take the worst possible case, the President of America may be true to his values and act in what he believes, which I quite possibly think he does. And yet, so he could actually have very high well-being because he does behave in the way which is true to what he believes. It's just that we don't like what he believes.
I don't know, I would probably argue that Trump's one of the most contradicting personalities I've ever met in what he says sometimes and what he does.
That's fake news.
Yeah, it's fake news, exactly. So I don't know if he'd be the best example of authentic by any means, but I think if you're showing up as who you are, you're standing up for what you believe and those values align, then absolutely. How do we measure that? It's a lot harder because some of the people who, and I see this all the time, some of the people that might talk about things or be in the space of certain areas, they might not really align at all with what they're talking about. And, you know, it's no different in any field. We see examples of that quite often where, you know, they might even be seen as the expert in an area, but their values don't, or their actions don't align. But I think it comes back to that true nature, very much like the root word of eudaimonia, really, that true nature, that living, aligning our values with our actions.
What concerns me, it is that it's very easy to misread somebody's authenticity because your measurement of it gets influenced by your own beliefs and values. Mm. So without a more objective way of measuring it, I get very skeptical about some of it.
Mm. So Peter, give me an example of when, so in measuring authenticity, what would you achieve though? Because of course, if we're measuring eudaimonic wellbeing as a whole, you're going to be able to look at a number of things like that meaning, that purpose, that personal growth, lots, but give me an example of measuring authenticity on its own. So what would be your purpose for that?
My purpose is really only just to better understand or measure the overall message that you're putting out. I'm concerned that we tend to overlay a lot of this with a set of values, so that it's very easy to look at a very spiritual, mindful, meditative person and say, oh yes, they're authentic to their values, where it's a lot harder to look at some outspoken, rebellious young person who may be authentic to his set of values. So that I'm concerned that in some ways we're biasing what we're trying to say. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you're saying. So it might be, if you were looking specifically at measuring it, it might be that first of all, you're discovering, and I guess it does come back to the individual, doesn't it? Like one might be living values that don't align with ours, but because they're living those values and their actions match those values, their well-being is going to be higher because it's what they value, it's what they believe. So there is a real area of individualism when it comes to this. but it might be about tapping into, okay, finding out what that person's values are, and then looking at what their actions are as well. The measurement might be that, so seeing, you know, if there is alignment there. But yeah, it might not be something that is desirable or that we agree with, but if they're being true to themselves, and they're living their values, then there's going to be authenticity there.
I think often authenticity is a judgment that we place on others too. And it's because our experience will be what we're hearing from them, and then how we're experiencing actions as well, so that we're weighing up this authenticity based on the message and the actions, and then making an assumption of whether that person is, authentic to those values. But authenticity may not be a value that they hold.
Yeah.
And therefore they don't see that. But if it's something that we hold, then it's going to clash with us, or we're going to actually be more attuned to that disconnect. So I think it actually it's how it plays out for us.
Unconscious bias.
Yeah.
Authenticity. Yeah.
Yeah. I read something a couple of days ago that was really interesting that said, when you work out, like when you know your own values, you can then work out why you get so frustrated with others, or why you get set off, because it often comes back to us. And that's why I love Parker J. Palmer's work so much around this, because he always says, listen to your most important teacher, your own inner teacher. That's where you're going to actually learn the most. You know, we often look towards other people or read other things, but when we attend to our own thoughts, our own reflections, and listen to ourselves, that's when we'll learn the most.
Although with authenticity,
perception is reality.
Sorry, what was that, Kate?
Okay.
Is it I feel like perception is reality. When you start talking about people's values, everybody has their own interpretation of what that means, and then the unconscious bias comes into, and it's our experiences with things. For example, 1% motorbike clubs. I was having this conversation the other day with someone, my mechanic. Obviously, I'm a bit of a revhead. And he was saying, like, when it comes to children's charities, all right, these 1% bikers will stop everything, get together, Bandidos, Hells Angels, Sphinx, a whole lot of them, that most of society goes, oh my God, they're all criminals, they're these big bad bikers and they do bad things all the time, and they're always trying to kill each other. Stop everything to raise money for the children, go on a fundraising ride, do all the, everybody's fine. And then once that event is over, then they go back to doing what they do. But they have these sets of values, the brotherhood, the loyalty, and it's part of their value system, is that you look after the children. So this is where I'm seeing the perception is reality when it comes to whether it's authenticity or integrity or whatever the value is based on your experience, is it not?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because again, like you wonder, is there a level of tokenism in there as well, or what's? I guess it always comes back to that start with why, doesn't it? That Simon Sinek, like why?
And the pursuit of happiness, that thing that happened when they made that movie. Do we pursue happiness if it's a present thing?
Yeah. Did I just do it to feel good in that moment, to make myself feel better about other things that maybe I'm not doing so well in? Because if that's the fact, then that's hedonic. That becomes more about, that hedonic well-being. I'm not sure. That's probably a bigger conversation. Ed, have you got any thoughts on that?
I think a really recent revelation for me has been a real investigation of my own values. Brene Brown's got a list of about 100. I'm happy to send it out to everyone. I'll give it to Peter to send out, to actually sit with that list of 100 values and narrow it down to about 2, and actually really explore for yourself what does matter most to me. And I've been doing, I'm a slow learner, I think. But I found that, and I know Peter and I have had conversations about this too, that doing this exploration around what we really value does make it really helpful for ourselves to see what triggers us, what we are passionate about. It really helps with meaning and purpose, and it also helps us process our emotions as well. And it helps us understand that particularly if we can have this conversation with those that are nearest and dearest to us, actually get them exploring their values, it's sort of like, oh, okay, I understand why we might butt heads a little bit, because they're perhaps a little bit different. And so there's a greater sense of self-awareness and awareness of others. And I think that helps for greater well-being collectively.
Yeah.
There's this real sense of peace when you know what your values are. And honestly, and it's only been recently that I've really nailed at least one of my values, which is collaboration. And when I think about, and that's why Andrew's discussion last time, we had Andrew Cochrane, who's done a whole work on values, talk to us. It is a hugely significant piece that we all just have to venture and discover for ourselves. I mean, everyone might be fully aware of what their values are, and I'm just slow to the table. But I think it's core to this eudaimonic happiness is actually knowing that, because our emotions spin off that too, whether happy or sad, and allow us to be a little more curious rather than reactive.
And then Ed too, thinking about your tribe within that. So really interesting. So when Brene was in Melbourne last year, I actually took my husband along, who is in a totally different field to me. I often think I'm right brain, he's left brain. He's a CFO. So we were sitting next to each other, and interestingly enough, Brene had her list of values there. So we all got a copy of it, and then we all had to go through and say which ones were us. And James and I, my husband and I, weren't even looking at each other or each other's forms, and we had circled out of the list of about 50 on the page the exact same two.
Wow.
And isn't that fascinating? We're so different, yet the two values that we circled were absolutely identical. Like they aligned perfectly. And I think there's something in that as well when we're talking about cultivating eudaimonic wellbeing and communities of wellbeing, that often we know that we work really well and there's more cohesion where there is actually an alignment in that value system too. So that's just something else to explore. But think about that authenticity really as sitting underneath the eudaimonic wellbeing, being a part of that. And if we're focusing on authenticity, then that's going to improve our eudaimonic wellbeing. It's going to increase it.
It's really helpful for everything that you've said, because I work with graduates and helping them find professional roles. And one of the parts of the job search, so it's applicable to a lot of job seekers or career transitioners, in finding companies where you share the values with. So you go and research the company that you're applying for. That's what you're doing. And then going and finding the values they have, and then doing an assessment or self-assessment on your own values so that you can make that connection. Because the whole idea is that to go to work for an organisation where you don't share the values, it sets up for failure and misery, basically, because it's not something that you want to get up out of bed to go to 5 days a week. So to find an organisation where you can connect those values, but it's not always. What we found was because you'd have 25 graduates in a room all doing the same sort of self-assessment on the different values, not realizing that it's the perception is reality piece again, where how you see what you see as loyalty and how you act out on loyalty can be different on how the next person would act out on what loyalty is, but it's still the same value. It just looks differently in two different people's worlds. And then trying to see that if loyalty is a piece in the organization, it's interesting how I've learned tonight how you've kind of separated, like probably in my head, a layman's terms of happiness and purpose, but it's sort of when you're looking for a career where it serves your purpose that you want to be happy in doing, it's really interesting how you've kind of broken down the pieces, and very applicable now with so many people out of work or transitioning careers, that it's a really powerful piece there to be able to come back to self and go, okay, what are my values and how do I find work that will, help me get back on purpose and keep me happy.
Spot on, Kate. And a lot of really clever organisations now that value eudaimonia, and I know I'll use Green School for an example, when they're hiring staff and organisations the same, they'll hire based on their values now.
They will, absolutely. I used to say, graduates hated it where I said, they don't care about your qualification. Forget the qualification.
Yeah.
They're looking for people who are going to fit into their culture and their team. They're looking at, you know, like what you value and how that works in with them. That not because anybody really could go and get the piece of paper without, you know, offending anyone.
That's
But
the point before. That's another word we commonly use with authenticity, fittingness. Like that fittingness, how well does it fit? And I think that's a good way of looking at it as well.
part of cultural and cultural diversity, or the inclusion and diversity piece in the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So sorry, Ed, I know we've gone significantly
I'll
over.
hand back to Peter in a minute. I just would like to thank you so much, Andrea. I know people have had to sort of disappear, but there's been a real appreciation for what you've shared